With 1 week out from the Iowa caucuses, CBS News polling shows a tight yet fluid race in the state. 26% of likely caucus goers say Senator Bernie Sanders is their top choice. Former Vice President Joe Biden is right behind him at 25%. Pete Buttigieg is within striking distance at 22%. Meanwhile, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar have 15% and 7% support, respectively. For more, let's bring in Caitlin Huey Burns, Anthony Salvanto, and Sean Sullivan. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. Anthony is CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys. He's in Washington. And Sean is a national politics reporter at the Washington Post and a CBSN political contributor. He is in Des Moines. Welcome to all of you. Anthony, I want to start with you. 15% is a key figure for the Iowa caucuses. Can you run through why that number may be so significant for candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar?
Yeah, hi, Elaine. Well, it's because a caucus isn't a conventional vote. It is a meeting. And the rules of the caucus often and can lead people to switch around their choices. In fact, everybody who gets below 15%, their supporters can move to their second choice or their third choice. So that's why I want to emphasize going in, don't look at this poll like it's a conventional horse race and look at it as, who are people considering? Well, one of the things to look at is that Bernie Sanders, he's the second choice of a lot of those Elizabeth Warren voters. She's got to stay above the threshold to help prevent her supporters then from going to Bernie Sanders. But Joe Biden, he's the second choice of a lot of those Amy Klobuchar supporters. If she doesn't make the 15% threshold in a lot of these caucuses, well, then some of her supporters could go over to him. That's part of what makes it all fluid. And of course, people could still go to Warren and go to Klobuchar in the process, too. That's what makes Iowa kind of fun, but also pretty interesting, Elaine.
Fun indeed. Well, Caitlin, former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg had a warning about the apparent frontrunner in the caucus, Bernie Sanders. He talked to Ed O'Keefe about that. Let's listen to some of that conversation.
On Saturday, your campaign sent at least 2 fundraising emails about Bernie Sanders. One of them said Bernie Sanders could be the nominee. That was in the subject line. In the body, it read, in part, if things stay steady until the Iowa caucuses, Bernie Sanders could be the nominee of our party. What would be so bad about that?
Well, our supporters want me to be the nominee, and so we're reminding them of what's at stake, of how many resources are coming into this state in order to make sure that the different competing camps do well, and to motivate those who want to see us turn the page, those who believe in my message of unifying the country to do bold things, and making sure that we're not leaving anything on the table.
Can he unify Democrats?
Well, as you might expect, I believe I'm the best candidate to unify Democrats and to unify Americans. Look, we can't go on like this as a country. And one of the reasons I always start out by reminding voters of what it's going to be like that first day after Donald Trump leaves office is that this is an election about how to turn the page and move America forward before it's too late.
So, Caitlin, at this point, why do you think the focus for Pete Buttigieg is not on Joe Biden, but on Bernie Sanders?
Well, Buttigieg certainly hopes to benefit from some voters who may be inclined to Joe Biden, but and want a more moderate or centrist candidate, they believe, but may be interested in Pete Buttigieg. But he's also trying to tap into this sentiment in the party. Those attracted to Bernie Sanders may be attracted to an outsider, someone that's not of Washington, but someone that is kind of new to the scene and talking about things a little bit differently. Unlike Joe Biden, he doesn't say we need to go back to the way things were before Trump. He talks about this new day before Trump. But we've also heard him, Pete Buttigieg, on the stump in his closing argument to Iowa voters, talk about this notion of electability, of actually being able to win. We're hearing that from a lot of candidates, but Buttigieg's pitch is that he can be someone who unites all factions of the party. So he hopes to benefit from some, from kind of being behind Joe Biden a little bit, but going after some of those Bernie Sanders supporters who may be inclined to someone who could offer to change some things up, although they are very different candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sean, Senator Elizabeth Warren received an endorsement from the Des Moines Register over the weekend. How has her campaign reacted to that?
Well, they're hoping that this is something that could give her a little bit of a boost in this final week, because if you look at her trajectory, she was doing really, really well in Iowa late in the summer of 2019 and in the early fall. But after that, she really started slipping. And as we've seen Senator Sanders on the rise, we've seen Biden sort of keep a hold on his position at or near the top of this field, she struggled to break through. But the Des Moines Register is the biggest newspaper in the state. It's the one that a lot of readers go to for their political news. So having an endorsement from the editorial board is the kind of thing that her supporters hope could give her a late boost in this race. It's also a way for the campaign to remind Iowans about her ideas and her candidacy at a time when she's in Washington for a lot of the week, dealing with the impeachment trial, serving as a juror in the Senate in that trial. And of course, we don't know how long that trial is ultimately going to go. So for Senators Warren and Sanders, it's a complication for their final pitch in Iowa. And for her, having this endorsement is something that her campaign is trying to broadcast to voters who might be on the fence, who might be looking for a candidate.
Well, Anthony, it's not just the caucus process that keeps Iowa a fluid race. It is the caucus goers themselves as well. Just over a third of those expressing a candidate choice say they've definitely made up their minds. How important will this be come caucus day?
Well, that mind-made-up question, that sometimes sounds like a classic pollster dodge, right? Well, a lot of people haven't made up their minds. Anything could happen. But no, look, in all seriousness, it's not just part of that process. One of the things underpinning Bernie Sanders' support throughout this race is that he has supporters who, more so than others, say that they've made up their minds and also say that they're enthusiastic about him. In fact, we've seen that over recent weeks where his supporters stay locked in and also are less likely to say that they're considering other candidates, whereas for other candidates, for Biden, he's got comparably fewer supporters who say they're locked in. Well, same thing with Warren, frankly. Well, here's another important part of that, Elaine, and that is that when you get to caucus time, it's going to be how will people decide? Well, Bernie Sanders is sort of lapping the field on measures like someone they think will fight for people like you. But Joe Biden has often been seen as the safe choice, and now he's got very high numbers on prepared to be commander in chief. So it's what voters will think is important that often determines who they actually ultimately settle on.
Well, Caitlin, Ed O'Keefe also interviewed Senator Amy Klobuchar on her campaign bus, and he asked her what her argument would be to someone who was deciding between Joe Biden and herself. Let's listen to some of that.
I say, number one, I'm in a new generation, and I am somewhere in between the ages of the Vice President and Mayor Pete. As I like to say, 59 is the new 38. And so that's the number one. And I have actually, number two, of course, he has vast experience, and our country has benefited because of that. But I have had the experience of governing in the last few years with Donald Trump.
So, Caitlin, really interesting to hear 59 is the new 38.
59 is the 38. Okay.
Learn
That's something
new.
that some people could get behind.
You know, is there enough time, though, as we look at the calendar realistically, and we know what's going on with the impeachment trial, for Senator Klobuchar to make up this gap that she has?
Right. She knows that, and she has to do well in New Hampshire, in Iowa, to be able to make it on to New Hampshire, especially because she's been campaigning as someone who comes from the Midwest. She comes from the neighboring state of Minnesota. And it was interesting to hear her second answer to that second point, trying to draw that distinction between herself and Joe Biden. Like Pete Buttigieg, she's been very reluctant to go after Biden because they've seen what happens when candidates do that. They tend to fall flat. But she's trying to say, look, Joe Biden has experience, but not with the Trump Republican Party. And that's something that when you talk to voters who are inclined to an Amy Klobuchar or a Joe Biden or even a Pete Buttigieg, this idea of working across the aisle, she is talking about working across the aisle in this kind of situation, which is very different from the Obama administration. So she certainly needs a boost. Every time you look up at your TV, if there is a break in the impeachment proceedings, you're likely to see Amy Klobuchar. Her team has been getting her out there, getting her to do remote hits for local media markets as well, doing a lot of cable news, trying to basically be on top of this conversation of impeachment. But there is no doubt that this is taking a really big toll, perhaps, on some of these candidates. And we'll see once the results come in, kind of how much they're missing out by not seeing these voters as much as they want to.
Right, as much as they want to. Sean, Joe Biden today had some really sharp words for Bernie Sanders after Sanders told CBS Evening News anchor Norah O'Donnell in an interview that the cost of his Medicare for All plan is, quote, impossible to predict. Here's what Biden said.
This does not cost, as everyone says, a minimum of $3.5 trillion per year, which is double the entire federal budget that is paid for now. But even Bernie says, and by the way, but we don't really know how much it's going to cost. We'll find out.
So, Sean, we know that Senator Sanders has been asked this question several times on the campaign trail. Is this a vulnerability for him?
It could potentially be. As I've traveled around the country over the past few months and I've talked to voters in different states, I've heard from many of them who have said, look, a lot of these ideas that the Democratic candidates are putting forth are ideas that they like, that they're intrigued by, but they are concerned about cost, financing, whether it would mean tax increases on them, how these plans would be paid for. And remember, when we look back to late last year, Senator Warren was under a lot of scrutiny about her own health care plan and whether it would mean middle-class tax increases or not. So for Senator Sanders right now, who is emerging as a top candidate, as we look at all these polls, both nationally and in the early states, he's at the top, if not near the top in many of these surveys. He's going to face a lot of questions like this, and that sort of comes with the territory when you become a leading candidate in the race, as he is right now.
Right. That was going to be my question here. Are we seeing attacks intensify here as we get closer to the caucuses?
Yeah, we really are seeing attacks intensify, and it really is a shift from what we've seen for much of this race when you had the candidates largely ignoring Senator Sanders. They looked at him as somebody who had a really, really loyal base, a base that they were not really likely to be able to tap into. And so you saw a lot of Buttigieg versus Warren, a lot of Biden versus Buttigieg, Biden versus Warren. Now you're seeing a lot of these candidates turn their attention to Senator Sanders. Ed's interview with Mayor Buttigieg makes that pretty clear. The fact that he's sending out these emails naming Bernie Sanders is a clear sign that he sees him as a threat. So you have a lot of mainstream Democrats, a lot of more traditional Democrats now getting nervous about Senator Sanders' candidacy. And you're seeing these candidates for the first time really become more hostile to him. The question is, what impact does that have? Because we're exactly a week away from the caucuses here in Iowa. And it's unclear whether that will have an impact one way or the other.
You know, one of the interesting things that's happened over the course of the recent primary campaigns is the insertion of sort of pressing foreign policy issues as part of our national conversation. So, Anthony, you also asked which of these candidates is most prepared to be commander-in-chief. What did you learn from that question?
Well, Joe Biden stood out on that measure. More than 8 in 10 Democrats, including, importantly, even people who aren't considering voting for him, think that he is prepared. And so while that could be a help to him, one of the other things you then ask is how important to that is that to Democrats right now? Mm-hmm. Well, foreign policy is important, they tell us, but it's outpaced by things like health care, like a candidate's position on climate change, certainly on electability, which we've been talking about throughout this process. So anytime you see an issue, it's not just who does well on it, but whether that's foremost in voters' minds as part of the consideration set. And when we talk about strategy, who's going after who, one of the things to remember in Iowa is it's not just which candidate thinks they can draw votes directly from somebody else, it's which candidates they think might be viable at a caucus meeting that would take delegates away from them. So you might see some strange bedfellows and you might see some strange alliances going forward here because of that sometimes very arcane and convoluted caucus strategy, too. It's all part of what makes it fun, but it's all part of what makes it, well, they'll probably just split the delegates and move on.
Right. Well, Caitlin, let me ask you, because there's an interesting data point here from our CBS News polling when it comes to gender in the Iowa caucus. Mm-hmm. So what did we see there?
Yeah, I'm so glad Anthony and his team asked this question about how people perceive a woman candidate against Donald Trump. And 54% of Iowans said it would be harder for a woman to defeat Donald Trump. And this comes, of course, as we've been talking about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and kind of the sparring that they had in the last debate over this alleged conversation. It also comes as Elizabeth Warren, in her final pitch to voters, has been talking a lot about gender on the campaign trail, saying, yes, a woman can win, trying to put to rest these questions about electability. Mm-hmm. What was interesting in the poll, according to the analysis by Anthony and his team, was that more women than men were likely to say that a woman would have a difficult time defeating Donald Trump. And I've talked to a lot of people about this on the campaign trail, especially voters who have this anxiety from 2016, and women voters especially, and this anxiety that they're feeling as they're becoming more like pundits, as they're becoming more in tune with what they think other people are going to decide. And so I think that speaks to this larger sentiment that we're seeing from voters, that they're really agonizing over this decision. They're thinking of a lot of different elements, not just policy like they used to, but can this candidate win? Can my friend or neighbor or someone else in the Midwest vote for him? These are the kinds of things that they're thinking about in the final stretch.
Yeah, such a different set of metrics than we've seen in the past. All right, Caitlin Huey Burns, Anthony Salvanto, and Sean Sullivan, thank you all very much.